Welcome to History in Ashes, where the past isn't just remembered, it's exhumed, brushed off, and studied under the faint light of what we think we know. Today, you're about to travel across centuries of smoke, sweat, and survival, the entire story of the United States of America. But before there were presidents, before there were pilgrims, and long before the words United States ever appeared on a map, this land was already old. So old that when you take your next breath, you're inhaling the same air that drifted above mammoths, mastodons, and forests that stood 1,000 generations before you. And here's a truth that might shock you when Europeans stumbled onto the shores of the so-called New World. There were already more people living across the Americas than in all of Europe. Entire civilizations, vast, complex, and deeply spiritual, thrived here. The city of Cahokia, near what's now Street Louis, had pyramids taller than anything in England at the time. The ancestral Puebloans carved entire villages into cliffsides that caught the morning light just right, and the Mississippians organized trade routes stretching from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. But history has a habit of erasing its earlier drafts. By the time Columbus arrived, millions of stories were already written. They were just never translated. Before we dive deeper, if you're watching this right now, I'd love for you to scroll down to the comments and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to imagine someone listening to the birth of a nation while it's midnight in Mumbai or sunrise in Seattle. And while you're down there, please hit that subscribe button. Don't make this channel go extinct like the woolly mammoth without your support. History in Ashes might just turn to, well, ashes. All right, let's go back, way back. Imagine it's not 2025, but something closer to 13,000 years ago. The ice sheets are retreating, and the world is shifting under the slow exhale of a melting planet. You're standing on what will one day be called Alaska, though no one calls it anything yet. The air smells sharp, like snow and salt and stone. To your east lies an open land bridge, the Beringia, a frozen highway stretching from Siberia to this new world. People begin crossing it, carrying fire, language, and memory. They don't know they're stepping into history. They just follow the herds, the seasons, the stars. As the millennia pass, their descendants scatter across continents, crafting cultures shaped by mountain, plain, and ocean. Some settle among red deserts and paint their stories on rock walls. Others raise great earthen mounds and chart constellations above their homes. They develop rituals, songs, and trade networks that hum with life. By the time Europeans set their sails, these people, ancestors of the Navajo, the Haudenosaunee, the Choctaw, and countless others, already speak hundreds of languages and understand the land in ways modern science still struggles to measure. But what's astonishing isn't just how they lived, it's how they adapted. In a land that stretched from tundra to tropical jungle, survival meant listening. To rivers, to animals, to silence. Farming didn't begin with European plows. It began here, with women tending maize, beans, and squash crops that would later feed entire empires. The concept of democracy, it wasn't invented in Philadelphia. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy practiced it centuries before Europeans even knew the word. Still, the story of early America isn't a peaceful one. There were wars, brutal, intimate, and devastating, fought not over ideology, but over survival. Tribes rose and fell. Alliances shifted like wind patterns. Yet what remained constant was the sense of belonging, that the land wasn't something to own, but something to share, honor, and maintain. If you listen closely, and I mean really listen, you can almost hear it still. The echo of drums over the plains, the whisper of arrows, the chant of a healing song carried on smoke. The continent was alive long before it was discovered. Then, everything began to change. Far across the Atlantic, kingdoms were growing restless. Gold, glory, and God. Those were the promises whispered to sailors and monarchs alike. The world was suddenly smaller, and curiosity had teeth. Ships began leaving European shores, slicing through uncharted waters like blades. They didn't know what they'd find, but they were certain it would belong to them once they did. When Columbus arrived in 1492, he didn't find an empty wilderness, he found nations, villages where laughter and music filled the air, people who greeted him with gifts and open hands. Within a few short decades, disease would turn those greetings into funerals. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Over 90% of the indigenous population, tens of millions of people perished from smallpox, influenza, and measles. Whole languages vanished overnight. Fields once full of maize grew wild again, the earth reclaiming what humans had lost. Yet the survivors endured. They held on to memory, to story, to the sacred idea that life would continue, even when everything else burned. And you sitting there, listening, you're part of that same continuum. Every highway, every city skyline, every song sung on this continent is layered over those ancient footsteps. The America you know isn't just stars and stripes, it's built atop ghosts and gardens. Before there was a United States, there was a world far older, deeper, and infinitely more complex. One not bound by borders but by rhythm, the rhythm of survival. And maybe that's the strangest part of all, that a land once so full of voices could be silenced so quickly. Yet, somehow, still be heard. When the first explorers returned to Europe with tales of this new world, they brought more than maps, they brought myths. They told of golden cities, docile natives, and endless wealth lies that would launch 1,000 ships. But the truth of America was never gold. It was grit. Next, those ships would return with settlers, priests, and soldiers, men and women who would plant not just crops, but empires. They'd bring iron, horses, and new gods. The collision of these worlds would not just change history, it would redefine humanity's idea of civilization itself. And here's a question for you to carry as we move forward. If one world's discovery meant another's destruction, what does that make discovery? You can almost smell it, the salt, the rot, the sweat, wooden ships creaking across the Atlantic, carrying not just explorers, but ambition. The year is 1500, something dates blur because the ocean doesn't keep calendars. The first Europeans who set foot on these shores weren't thinking of founding nations. They were thinking of gold, of salvation, and of glory. And behind those thoughts lurked something darker: possession. To call what followed a discovery feels dishonest. This wasn't discovery. It was collision. When European sails appeared on the horizon, two worlds met, and one would never recover. You might imagine Columbus as a wide-eyed sailor chasing adventure, but history's less romantic. The voyage wasn't about curiosity. It was a business venture, sponsored, calculated, and backed by monarchs who wanted a return on investment. Within decades, the Spanish and Portuguese carved up the continents like spoils. Priests followed soldiers, and banners followed prayers. In the Caribbean, entire island populations disappeared under the weight of forced labor and imported disease. In Mexico, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city larger and cleaner than any in Europe, fell to Hernán Cortés and a handful of men armed with steel and audacity. In Peru, Francisco Pizarro toppled an empire that stretched across mountains and jungles, using betrayal and smallpox as his greatest weapons. And northward, the land that would one day call itself America watched these flames spreading south and east, slowly creeping closer. At first, there were whispers of opportunity. Spanish explorers like Juan Ponce de Leon and Hernando de Soto wandered across the Florida swamps and Mississippi valleys, searching for fountains of youth and rivers of gold. They found none. What they found instead were people who didn't understand the word conquer. Then came the French. They didn't want gold, they wanted fur. In the cold forests of what's now Canada, they built alliances with tribes like the Huron and Algonquin, trading beads and muskets for pelts that fetched fortunes in Europe. They learned the rivers, married into tribes, and left a quieter mark, though still a mark carved in the same wood of exploitation. The English arrived later, and their ambitions were different still. They didn't just want to trade, they wanted to stay. It's hard to imagine now, but the first English settlers weren't heroes. They were desperate men, hired labourers, and second sons with no inheritance. When they landed in Jamestown in 1607, they were more likely to die of dysentery than glory. Within a year, 2/3 of them were dead. Their grand dreams of wealth dissolved into hunger so severe that some resorted to cannibalism, and yet they survived. Barely. Thanks to the help of the Powhatan Confederacy, who showed them how to grow maize and navigate the seasons. A fragile alliance formed, built on trade and misunderstanding. The settlers wanted land. The Powhatan saw them as temporary guests. Only one of those assumptions turned out to be true. You can trace the early bones of America right there in that uneasy peace between hunger and hope. Tobacco would soon save the struggling colony, though it would also curse it, because growing it demanded land. Land demanded labor, and labor, as they would soon decide, could be bought. By 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia. They didn't come seeking opportunity or adventure. They came in chains, forced across the Atlantic under the unbearable weight of human greed. Their presence marked the start of something that would define America's contradictions for centuries, the pursuit of freedom built on bondage. It's tempting to think of these early colonies as unified, but they were anything but. The Puritans in New England fled religious persecution only to build communities where their own brand of persecution thrived. The Dutch in New Amsterdam were traders first, moralists later. The French clung to their missions, the Spanish to their silver, the English to their survival. By the late 1600s, 13 scattered colonies had begun to take root along the Atlantic coast. They were rough, self-reliant, and deeply superstitious. Towns had stocks and whipping posts before they had schools. Witch trials could turn a gossip into a corpse overnight. And yet, among the chaos, something new began to grow in identity, raw and unpolished, but distinct. You can almost hear it. The crackle of hearth fires, the murmurs of sermons, the scratch of quills writing letters back home. We are still alive. The soil is good. The harvest was fair. Come join us. But beneath those letters was another truth. The soil was good because it was taken. The harvest was fair because someone else's field had been burned. As decades passed, the colonies became a mosaic of contradictions, freedom seekers and slavers, dreamers and exploiters, believers and opportunists. The forests fell, replaced by fields and fences. Native tribes were pushed westward, promises broken as fast as they were spoken. The wilderness shrank. The myth of empty land grew. And through it all, the Atlantic never stopped moving. Ships carried sugar, rum, and slaves in a deadly triangle that connected Africa, the Caribbean, and America. Economies rose on cruelty, and churches preached salvation over the sound of cracking whips. You, sitting there, might feel a strange tension, that feeling when you realize a nation's foundation was poured in equal parts hope and hypocrisy. And that's the truth of early America. For every dream of liberty, there was a ledger counting human lives. But history isn't about guilt, it's about recognition. Every freedom we enjoy was purchased by someone's suffering. Every ideal began as an argument, shouted into the wind by people who believed they could build something better, even when surrounded by their own contradictions. By the early 1700s, a new generation had been born on American soil. They didn't see themselves as Englishmen anymore. They were something different, harder, freer, suspicious of authority. The old world felt far away, and the idea of obedience felt outdated. Whispers of rebellion began to stir in taverns and churches. The colonies were still subjects of the British Crown, but their hearts were already elsewhere. And so, as the forests thinned and towns grew, the question quietly began to take shape. How long can people born in freedom live under a king? You wake to the sound of bells, not church bells, but the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere in a colonial village. The year is 1750-something. The streets are narrow, muddy, and loud with the clatter of horses and the gossip of merchants. You smell bread baking, ale fermenting, and smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. This is America before it was America. 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic like barnacles on a ship's hull. The British Empire stretches across the globe now. The sun, they say, never sets on it. But here, in the raw, unpredictable wilderness of North America, that empire feels distant. The colonies are growing restless. Taxes, tariffs, and royal decrees reach them like echoes delayed, distorted, and unwelcome. You can sense it in the way people talk, a shift from our king to their king. Still, rebellion isn't yet a cry, it's a murmur. Most colonists are too busy trying to survive to dream of independence. Life is hard. Winters are brutal. Food spoils. Disease comes and goes like an unwelcome neighbor. And yet, amidst the hardship, something powerful is happening, the birth of identity. Colonial America is a patchwork of contradictions. In Massachusetts, Puritan discipline rules with iron certainty. In Virginia, planters live like minor aristocrats, their wealth built on enslaved labor. In Pennsylvania, Quakers preach peace and equality while trading with merchants who profit from war. Each colony has its own laws, its own customs, its own accent, but one thing binds them all: the quiet belief that they deserve a say in their own destiny. Then comes the spark, not from within, but from far away. The French and Indian War erupts in the 1750s, part of a larger global struggle between Britain and France. The colonies fight alongside British soldiers to defend land neither side truly owns. They bleed together in muddy forests, ambushed by warriors who know the terrain better than any European mapmaker. When the war finally ends, Britain claims victory, but victory comes with a bill. To pay for it, the crown turns to its colonies. Taxes on sugar, paper, tea, small things, perhaps, but heavy in principle. The colonists protest. "No taxation without representation," they shout, though the phrase is more about frustration than philosophy. What they mean is simple. We fought your war, we paid your dues, and now you want more? And here's the irony at first. The protests aren't about independence. The colonists don't want to break away. They just want to be heard. But the British Parliament doesn't listen. Power rarely does. Instead, they double down, sending soldiers, imposing new taxes, and treating the colonies like disobedient children. The tension grows. In Boston, soldiers march through cobblestone streets, while shopkeepers glare from behind frosted windows. In taverns, men whisper of rebellion, their words hidden beneath the foam of cheap ale. Pamphlets circulate Thomas Paine's Common Sense, spreads like wildfire, written not for kings or scholars, but for ordinary people who've had enough. And in that fury, the first blood spills. The Boston Massacre. Redcoats fire into a crowd. 5 colonists die, and the echo of those gunshots reverberates across the continent. Soon after comes the Boston Tea Party, a night of defiance disguised as mischief. Men dressed as Mohawks dump tea into the harbour, the water turning dark and bitter with rebellion. London's response? Fury. The king and his ministers tighten their grip, sending fleets and soldiers. But power, once challenged, rarely regains its old authority. The colonies begin to unite, not through shared love, but through shared resentment. And you, standing there in the middle of it, would feel the tension like static in the air. It's no longer a question of if something will happen. It's when. In Philadelphia, delegates gather in secret, debating ideas that sound treasonous one day and prophetic the next. Men like Jefferson, Adams, Franklin flawed, ambitious, contradictory, begin to imagine a world without a crown. They argue, they compromise, they write. Words become weapons, sharper than muskets. And then, on a humid day in July of 1776, they sign their names to the most dangerous document in the world, the Declaration of Independence. Think about that for a moment. Ordinary men, merchants, farmers, lawyers, declaring to the most powerful empire on earth that they are free. It's not just a political act, it's madness wrapped in courage. Every signature is a death sentence if the revolution fails. But they sign anyway, and so the colonies become a nation, at least on paper. In reality, it's chaos. There's no standing army, no real government, no money, no navy, just a collection of farmers, blacksmiths, and dreamers facing the disciplined might of the British Empire. George Washington takes command of the Continental Army, a man with more resolve than resources. His troops fight in rags, starve through winters, and march barefoot through snow that stains red with frostbite and blood. They lose more battles than they win, but they never stop fighting. Across the ocean, Britain assumes it's just another colonial rebellion, a nuisance that will end with a few hangings. But wars built on arrogance have a way of surprising their victors. France, still bitter from its own defeat, sees opportunity. Supplies, ships, and soldiers begin flowing to the Americans. What started as rebellion becomes revolution. The fighting drags on for 8 long years. Cities burn, fields are ruined, families are divided, brother against brother, father against son. The cost of freedom isn't paid in gold, it's paid in grief. And yet, somehow, impossibly, against every reasonable expectation, the Americans win. At Yorktown, in 1781, British General Cornwallis surrenders. The world shifts on its axis. The United States of America, a phrase that once sounded like fantasy, becomes reality, but victory brings new problems. The war has ended, but the experiment has just begun. How do you build a nation out of rebellion? How do you govern people who've just learned to distrust authority? The Founding Fathers, for all their vision, are haunted by their contradictions. They speak of liberty while owning slaves. They design a republic, yet fear democracy. They preach equality, but only for men like themselves. Still, they write the Constitution. They draft the Bill of Rights. They create something fragile, something flawed, but something unprecedented. A government not built on birthright, but on belief. And so, out of war and uncertainty, a new world emerges. But beneath the fireworks and parades, beneath the patriotic songs and printed slogans, lies an unspoken truth. They didn't yet know if it would work, and maybe that's where all great nations begin, not in certainty, but in doubt. So as the ink dries and the flags rise, here's a thought to linger on. What's more dangerous, tyranny or freedom without a plan? You can almost feel the silence that follows the war, the kind that comes after the smoke clears and the cheers fade. The year is 1780-something, and the newborn United States stands blinking in the light, like a child who's just realized the world is larger and harsher than imagined. Independence is won, but peace doesn't come easy. The revolution left the nation broke, divided, and directionless. Soldiers return home to find their farms ruined, debts unpaid, and their promised wages just words on paper. Congress, weak under the Articles of Confederation, can barely hold the country together. There's no national army, no strong executive, no stable currency, just 13 states pulling in 13 different directions. You can almost hear the arguments stretching from Boston to Savannah. What now? The idea of unity sounds poetic but feels impossible. States fight over borders, trade tariffs, and old grudges. The government can't even collect taxes. And in Massachusetts, angry farmers rise up in what becomes known as Shays' Rebellion. Men who once fought side by side against the British now march against their own government, demanding fairness from leaders who barely exist. It's chaos, not the loud, heroic kind, but the quiet, hungry kind that makes nations rot from the inside. Out of that turmoil comes a realization. Freedom means nothing without order. The dream of liberty is noble, but without structure, it's just wind in tall grass. So, in 1787, delegates gather in Philadelphia once again. The same city where independence was declared now becomes the workshop of a constitution. It's summer, the air thick and heavy, and the men inside Independence Hall argue for weeks. They argue about power, representation, and control, who gets it, who doesn't, and how to keep it from turning into tyranny again. The debates are fierce. Some want a strong central government, others fear it will become another monarchy in disguise. Slavery, the ghost that haunts every discussion, is never truly confronted, just postponed. And yet, despite their flaws and fears, they manage to create something extraordinary. A framework that can bend without breaking. The Constitution becomes the skeleton of the United States, strong, flexible, imperfect. It's ratified in 1788, and George Washington, the reluctant general, becomes the first president a year later. Imagine him tall, quiet, weary, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, hand on the Bible, taking an oath to serve a nation still trying to define what that word means. He doesn't seek power. He accepts it because no one else can hold it. Washington's presidency becomes the steady heartbeat of a fragile republic. He sets precedents with every decision: 2 terms, a peaceful transfer of power, a cabinet of advisors, traditions we now take for granted, but which could have easily unraveled. His leadership gives the new nation something it desperately needs: dignity. But even as Washington works to hold it together, the cracks are already showing. The founding generation that united against a king now divides over how to rule themselves. Alexander Hamilton dreams of an industrial America with a strong central bank, a modern economy, and international influence. Thomas Jefferson imagines a republic of farmers, simple and virtuous, guided by the wisdom of the land. Their feud defines the nation's political soul. Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, the first parties, born out of the same revolution that once promised unity. Meanwhile, beyond the eastern cities, settlers are pushing west. The frontier calls vast forests, endless rivers, and danger in every direction. Native nations, already battered by disease and displacement, now face waves of settlers hungry for land. Treaties are signed and broken in the same breath. Each step westward is both triumph and tragedy. The American dream for some, the beginning of erasure for others. And if you look closely, you'll notice something else stirring commerce. Ships leaving New England carry goods to Europe and the Caribbean. Southern plantations grow rich from cotton and tobacco, their profits resting on the backs of enslaved men and women who labor from sunrise to death. The contradiction deepens. A free republic built on bondage. By the time Washington leaves office, the young nation is already at a crossroads. In his farewell address, he warns against political factions and foreign entanglements, advice that future generations will ignore almost immediately. He steps down not because he's tired, but because he knows what too much power does to men. He retires to Mount Vernon, a farmer once more, leaving behind a country still learning how to breathe. His successor, John Adams, inherits a storm. France, once an ally, turns hostile. Britain never truly forgives. Inside America, partisan newspapers tear the nation apart with words sharper than any sword. Adams responds with the Alien and Sedition Acts laws that punish dissent in a country founded on it. The public turns against him. Then comes Jefferson, idealist, visionary, and contradiction incarnate. He speaks of liberty while owning slaves, preaches small government while orchestrating the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the nation's size overnight. Imagine the map: the United States, once a sliver of land hugging the Atlantic, now stretching into an unknown wilderness. The deal is bold, maybe reckless, but it captures the country's spirit perfectly. Restless, hungry, unsatisfied. Explorers Lewis and Clark set out to map this new territory. They cross mountains, trace rivers, and meet tribes who watch them with wary curiosity. Guided by Sacagawea, they survive storms, hunger, and near-death proof that exploration, like freedom, demands endurance. As the 1800s dawn, America stands on the edge of transformation. Cities grow, industry hums, immigrants arrive by the thousands, chasing promises they can't yet see. But beneath the optimism lies tension between North and South, freedom and slavery, progress and exploitation. The experiment continues, but no one knows how long it can last. And you listening now might sense the same unease they felt then, the pride of creation mixed with the fear of collapse. The United States has been born, but it hasn't yet learned how to live. It's a nation of contradictions, ambitious, flawed, and fragile. The ink of its constitution is barely dry, yet already stained with compromise. So before we move forward, consider this. If the foundation of freedom is built on imperfection, can it ever truly stand unshaken? You're still here, good. Because this is where things start to burn, quite literally. The birth of the United States was never a clean affair. It was a messy, smoke-filled forge where ideals met muskets and parchment met gunpowder. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 colonies had grown tired of being treated like rebellious teenagers by their far-off parent, the British Crown. Imagine being taxed for every sheet of paper, every cup of tea, and every imported good, while not having a single say in how those decisions were made. That's not governance. That's daylight robbery, in powdered wigs. The average colonist in those days wasn't thinking of independence, though. They were thinking of surviving harsh winters, feeding their families, and trying to avoid diseases that swept through towns faster than gossip in a tavern. But anger has a strange way of creeping in quietly, growing in the corners of dinner tables and church pews. When King George's men started marching through colonial streets and demanding obedience, something snapped. In 1773, the Boston Harbor turned into one of history's most famous tea kettles. Colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, hurled crates of British tea into the icy water, an act that was both defiance and desperation. To London, it was vandalism. To Boston, it was liberation. And to you, if you'd been standing there that night, it would have felt like watching a nation being born under the cover of darkness and the scent of wet tea leaves. By 1775, muskets fired at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world wasn't a grand explosion of freedom, but rather a confused skirmish between farmers and redcoats. Yet, from that spark rose a war that would last 8 long years. Imagine yourself trudging through mud in worn leather boots, carrying a musket with a flint that barely sparks, and hoping you make it through one more freezing night. The American Revolution wasn't fought by marble heroes, it was fought by ordinary people, scared, hungry, and wildly outnumbered. George Washington wasn't a mythical figure then. He was a weary man, trying to hold together a threadbare army with courage and borrowed shoes. At Valley Forge, during that bitter winter of 1777, men slept on frozen ground, wrapped in tattered blankets, some leaving bloody footprints in the snow. You can almost hear their coughs echo through the wind, and their whispered prayers that this fight wasn't in vain. Meanwhile, the grand thinkers, the Jeffersons, Franklins, and Adamses, scribbled their dreams on parchment, shaping ideas that would define a nation. The Declaration of Independence wasn't just elegant prose, it was a death sentence if the war was lost. Each signature was a gamble, a public declaration that said, "We'd rather die than kneel." And yet, even as they wrote of liberty and equality, the colonies were steeped in contradictions. Enslaved men and women tilled fields and built fortunes for men who preached freedom. Women tended homes, ran businesses, and cared for wounded soldiers, but their names were barely remembered. The revolution promised liberty, but practiced hierarchy. It was a start, not a solution. When victory finally came in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris, it didn't feel like triumph. Cities lay in ruin, farms were destroyed, and a new question loomed like a storm cloud. Now what? How do you build a country from scratch without kings, without traditions of governance, and with a population that barely agreed on what freedom meant? In that fragile dawn of independence, there was no certainty, only hope wrapped in exhaustion. The ink on the peace treaty was barely dry when debates began over the Constitution, slavery, states' rights, and the balance of power. The United States wasn't a united anything yet. It was an experiment, a grand, risky one. And as the young republic stumbled into existence, there lingered a question that has never truly gone away. When a nation is built on revolution, how long before it needs another? The new nation began not with parades and certainty, but with confusion and debt. By the late 1780s, the so-called United States were more like 13 nervous roommates sharing a house they couldn't afford. Each state had its own currency, its own taxes, and its own idea of what freedom should look like. Some were bustling and wealthy, others were barely hanging on. What bound them wasn't unity, it was exhaustion from war and the vague hope that they could somehow make this democracy thing work. The Articles of Confederation, their first attempt at a governing system, was a well-meant disaster. Congress could declare war, but couldn't collect taxes to pay for one. It could make treaties, but couldn't enforce them. Picture trying to run a household where everyone agrees to buy furniture, but no one pays for it. That was America in its infancy, idealistic, broke, and bickering. Then came the Constitutional Convention of 1787, that famous Philadelphia summer where men in powdered wigs locked themselves in a room and argued for months about power, liberty, and whether people could be trusted to govern themselves. It was hot, smelly, and tense. They weren't just writing laws, they were designing a country from scratch. And the truth is, much of what they wrote was guesswork. The constitution they drafted wasn't perfect. It was a compromise, stitched together by competing fears. Small states feared being swallowed by big ones, the South feared losing its slaves, and everyone feared a return to monarchy. The result was a document so carefully balanced that it was practically built to wobble. Yet somehow, it worked. George Washington, reluctant but revered, became the first president in 1789. If you had been there, you wouldn't have seen fireworks or triumph. You'd have seen a tall, solemn man, more farmer than king, quietly swearing an oath on a Bible in New York City, a temporary capital. The crowd was hopeful but wary, as though they were watching a new kind of experiment unfold before their eyes. Washington's presidency was about survival, not glory. There were no political parties yet, at least not officially, but divisions were already forming. Alexander Hamilton dreamed of a powerful central government and a thriving economy built on commerce. Thomas Jefferson envisioned a simpler republic of farmers, suspicious of banks and big cities. Their feud would define the next century of American politics. Meanwhile, the country itself was expanding like spilled ink. New territories were being surveyed, native tribes displaced, and settlers moved westward into lands already inhabited for thousands of years. To those settlers, the frontier was opportunity. To those who lived there first, it was invasion. History remembers the expansion as destiny, but at its heart, it was conquest, slow, deliberate, and relentless. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was added, giving citizens freedoms that would become the soul of American identity: speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to bear arms. But even then, not everyone enjoyed those rights equally. The people meant white men with property. Women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans remained outside the promise of liberty. The young republic stumbled through crises, rebellions, debts, foreign threats, but somehow endured. Washington refused a third term, stepping down in a gesture that astonished the world. Here was a man who could have been king, choosing instead to go home. That single act set a precedent stronger than any law. Power, in this nation, was meant to end peacefully. As the new century approached, Americans began to believe they were living in something unprecedented, a land that could constantly reinvent itself. But beneath the pride, the same fractures lingered. North versus South, federal versus state, freedom versus hypocrisy. And as the new century dawned, one could already sense that the ideal of liberty would one day collide head-on with the nation's original sin, slavery. The United States, still young and fragile, faced its gravest test yet. By the early 1800s, the country was expanding, bustling, and divided all at once. The North was industrializing, cities growing with factories, merchants, and immigrants. The South remained largely rural, dominated by plantations and enslaved labor. And as you listen now, you can almost feel the tension stretching across rivers, forests, and farmlands, a tension as thick as smoke from 100 chimneys. You should probably pause and subscribe if you haven't yet. Seriously, without your support, history in ashes will just vanish like a forgotten colony, and we can't continue telling these stories. So, click that button and keep this journey alive, because what comes next is both tragic and unforgettable. The nation's expansion brought not just settlers, but conflicts. Native peoples were pushed farther west, treaties were broken, and resentment simmered on both sides. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size overnight, but with land came the question: which states would allow slavery, and which would not? The delicate balance Washington and his successors fought to maintain began to crack. By the 1850s, Debates over slavery grew louder and deadlier. The invention of the cotton gin had made the South immensely profitable, but also more dependent on enslaved labor. The North, industrializing and gradually moving toward abolition, began to see this system as morally intolerable. Newspapers printed fiery editorials, politicians shouted in chambers, families split along ideological lines, and all the while, ordinary Americans, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers were drawn into arguments that seemed both abstract and deeply personal. The compromise that had held the nation together for decades was breaking. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, they were all attempts to paper over a wound that had been festering since the nation's founding. And the wound was deep. It wasn't just political, it was human. Families were torn apart. Communities were divided. The nation teetered on the edge of something catastrophic. Then, finally, it happened. 1761, or rather 1861, if you count the new century, saw the first shots fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The country erupted in civil war. It wasn't a quick, glorious battle. It was a grinding, relentless conflict that would last 4 long, terrible years. Cities burned, fields were trampled under marching armies, and rivers ran red with blood. You can almost hear the despair in letters written home by soldiers. Families torn apart, supplies scarce, comrades dying from disease as often as from bullets. Life in the North and South became a struggle for survival, not just victory. Women managed farms and businesses while men fought. Children learned to read newspapers with names of towns they'd never see, many filled with obituaries instead of achievements. Abraham Lincoln emerged as a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. He was a man who understood the fragility of the nation and the necessity of preserving it. His speeches, measured yet moral, reminded Americans what was at stake, the very idea of a united country. When he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he was not just freeing enslaved people, he was redefining the moral center of the United States, even as bullets and disease claimed more lives every day. Battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh became symbols of endurance. Imagine standing in those fields, mud sucking at your boots, cannon smoke clouding the sky, and knowing the outcome could decide the fate of an entire civilization. Ordinary men and women became actors in a story far larger than themselves, their courage and suffering etched into the land itself. And yet, even in victory, the country was scarred. The South lay in ruins, the economy shattered, and the promise of equality still far from reality. Reconstruction attempted to stitch the nation back together, but the wounds ran deep. Freedmen faced violence, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. Laws were passed, then circumvented. Hope flickered like a candle in a storm, bright yet precarious. So, as you sit and listen, think about this. A nation can survive bullets, famine, and political betrayal, but can it survive the contradictions in its own soul? Because by the time the war ended, America had proven it could endure, but it had also shown how fragile freedom could be. And that fragility would define the next century of growth, industry, and transformation. And here's the question that hangs over everything that follows. When a nation is reborn from its own blood, how long before it must face itself again? You wake to the clatter of industry. The year is 1875. And the United States is no longer just a nation. It is a restless, grinding machine. The smoke from chimneys and the hiss of steam engines fills the air like a new kind of weather. Cities rise from the dust, and towns that were once mere crossroads now throb with factories, mills, and railroad depots. America is in the midst of transformation, and the transformation is loud, chaotic, and, in many ways, unforgiving. The Industrial Revolution has arrived on this continent with a force that feels unstoppable. You can see it in the railroads snaking across the plains, carrying iron, coal, and people in equal measure. You can hear it in the rhythmic pounding of hammers in Pittsburgh steel mills, and you can smell it in the thick smoke that hangs over New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Life has changed, but survival remains as raw and demanding as ever. Ordinary Americans, immigrants, farmers, laborers are the ones who feel it most. They live in tenements, crowded with strangers, their children working 12-hour shifts in factories, their health constantly under siege from soot, heat, and fatigue. Immigration surges as Europe faces famine, political upheaval, and unrest. Irish families escape the potato blight, carrying grief and determination across the Atlantic. Germans flee religious persecution, bringing skills and traditions to a land that promises opportunity but delivers uncertainty. Italian, Polish, and Scandinavian immigrants arrive, too, swelling the city's populations with languages, smells, and customs that will forever alter the culture of this rapidly industrializing nation. To stand on a city street in New York in 1875 is to hear 1,000 tongues and witness thousands of dreams, each one weighed down by the same simple necessity: survival. But while the cities roar, the countryside whispers a different story. Farmers struggle with falling crop prices, soil exhaustion, and the encroachment of railroads and industry. The Homestead Act, passed decades earlier, has offered millions of acres of land for settlement, but taming the frontier is no small feat. Settlers face wild rivers, harsh winters, and native tribes fighting to defend the land they've lived on for centuries. You can almost picture a family in Nebraska, children huddled by the fire while the wind howls outside, wondering if the farm will endure another frost, another drought, another season of loss. The South, meanwhile, is in transition. The Civil War has ended a decade earlier, but the scars remain vivid. Freedmen work the fields that were once their chains, yet freedom is a daily negotiation. Sharecropping and tenant farming replace slavery, and many find themselves trapped in cycles of debt and oppression. Violence still lurks in towns and plantations. Ku Klux Klan activity spreads, instilling terror and asserting white supremacy, while new laws are crafted to limit the political and economic power of African Americans. The promise of freedom is real but incomplete, fragile as a candle flickering in a storm. Industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion all collide with politics. The Gilded Age emerges, a period named for its shiny veneer, masking profound corruption and inequality. Monopolies rise, captains of industry accumulate unimaginable wealth, and labor unrest boils over in strikes and riots. In Chicago, the Haymarket Affair turns violent, leaving both workers and policemen dead. In Pennsylvania, coal miners strike for better pay and safer conditions, their bodies crushed by machinery or the weight of indifference. The question of labor versus capital becomes central to the identity of this nation. Who truly holds power in America, and at what cost? Technology spreads, changing the rhythm of life. Telegraphs shrink distances, connecting cities to distant towns almost instantly. Railroads allow people and goods to traverse the continent in days rather than months. The invention of the telephone and improvements in electricity hint at a future that seems magical yet inevitable. And while this progress dazzles, it also deepens divides. Cities grow richer, but slums expand alongside factories. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, while the masses toil in precarious, often dangerous conditions. Education begins to emerge as a response to change. Public schools expand, literacy rises, and newspapers proliferate. Knowledge is increasingly seen as power, though access remains unequal. Women, too, begin to challenge societal norms, seeking education, suffrage, and a voice in the public sphere. The seeds of reform are planted, but they will take decades to bear fruit. Meanwhile, Native Americans face relentless pressure from westward expansion. Tribes are confined to reservations, often on lands unsuitable for farming or hunting. Traditional ways of life are disrupted. Children are sent to government-run boarding schools where they are forbidden to speak their languages or practice their culture. Resistance is met with violence. Survival here is not just physical, it is cultural. Every drumbeat silenced, every language forbidden, is a small death. yet communities endure, holding on to traditions in secret and in memory. The nation's foreign policy begins to stretch its limbs. Alaska is purchased from Russia in 1867, adding vast new territories to the map. Trade with Asia increases. The United States begins to flex its growing influence, tentatively stepping onto the world stage, testing itself beyond the continent. Expansion and ambition define its foreign interactions, though the principles of freedom and democracy it preaches are not yet universally applied at home. Even as the country grows, it is still haunted by the consequences of its contradictions. Slavery may be abolished in the South, but racial inequality persists. Industrial wealth grows, but poverty follows closely behind. Expansion promises opportunity, yet it brings displacement and conflict. The United States is a nation of contrasts, resilient yet fragile, progressive yet regressive, idealistic yet deeply pragmatic. Every corner of the country tells a story. In New York, tenement families make art out of necessity, improvising warmth and light in the face of squalor. In Boston, immigrant children memorize lessons and work in factories, balancing education with survival. On the plains, settlers battle frost and prairie fires, learning to farm and live in a landscape that is as unforgiving as it is vast. In the South, freedmen navigate the complex terrain of freedom, asserting agency in a world that still tries to deny it. Railroads, canals, and rivers are the lifelines connecting these disparate experiences. Mail and telegraphs allow ideas, money, and rebellion to flow. And in every instance, human resilience is the constant, the uncelebrated hero of American history. People adapt, improvise, endure. Every hardship endured, every injustice navigated, is a testament to survival, whether remembered or forgotten. And through all this, America is still asking itself fundamental questions. What is freedom worth if it doesn't apply to everyone? How does a nation reconcile its ideals with its actions? How long can it endure the tension between expansion, progress, and justice? By the end of the 1800s, the United States has transformed from a fragile post-war republic into a rapidly industrializing nation. But it is still raw, imperfect, and untested on the world stage. The country has survived civil war, economic upheaval, and social unrest. Yet the same issues that haunted its infancy, inequality, exploitation, and moral contradiction, still pulse beneath the surface. And as you listen, you can imagine the human scale of it all. A factory worker wiping soot from his face, a child learning letters by candlelight, a settler watching the horizon for storms, a freedman walking cautiously through a town still hostile to his presence. Their lives are ordinary, their struggles immense, and their endurance remarkable. The United States, at this moment, is not yet a superpower. It is a nation growing into itself, full of promise, danger, and contradiction. Every railroad laid, every law passed, every life lived in hardship adds to the mosaic of what America will become. And yet, the questions of justice, equality, and survival remain unresolved, waiting for the next chapter of history to test them again. And here is the thought to linger on as we pause in this moment. Can a nation continue to expand and progress while still wrestling with the shadows of its own past? By the turn of the 20th century, the United States is a nation transformed, yet restless, teetering between its past and an uncertain future. Skyscrapers begin to pierce the skyline of cities like New York and Chicago, signaling ambition as much as ingenuity. Railroads lace the country together, bringing goods, people, and ideas to places once isolated. America is industrial, urban, and globally aware, but beneath the shiny surface, the nation is grappling with the consequences of its rapid growth. The Gilded Age has left the country wealthy and unequal. Magnates like Carnegie and Rockefeller amass fortunes that seem almost obscene, building empires in steel and oil, while millions of laborers toil in dangerous factories for paltry wages. Life in these industrial cities is a constant negotiation with survival. Tenements are overcrowded, plumbing is rare, Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis claim the young and old alike. The streets are crowded with horse-drawn carts, telegraph wires, and people streaming to work. You can imagine the daily rhythm, the clanging of factory machinery, the cries of street vendors, the whistle of steam engines. This is progress, yes, but it is also chaos, dust, and danger. All at once, immigration surges. Millions of Europeans arrive seeking opportunity. They bring languages, customs, and traditions that will forever shape American culture. Yet they are met with suspicion and prejudice. Italians, Poles, Jews, Irish, and others live in ethnic enclaves where survival often trumps comfort. Children work in sweatshops, men labor in mines and factories, and families crowd into small apartments where privacy is a luxury they cannot afford. Yet, even in these harsh conditions, communities form, markets, churches, and cultural traditions flourish, creating a resilience that will carry them forward. In the South, the legacy of the Civil War continues to define life. Reconstruction may be over, but freedom is still fragile. Jim Crow laws entrench segregation. Violence is a constant threat. Freedmen navigate a society designed to suppress them, carving out pockets of autonomy where they can. Schools are underfunded, jobs limited, and political power nearly non-existent. Yet, African Americans persist, building communities, churches, and institutions in the shadows of oppression. Every small victory is an act of survival and defiance, though the cost is high and the path treacherous. Meanwhile, the United States begins flexing on the world stage. The Spanish-American War in 1898 signals America's arrival as a global power. Territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines come under American control. The nation grapples with the implications of imperialism, balancing ideals of democracy with the reality of conquest. For ordinary Americans, the war is both distant and immediate. Sons, brothers, and fathers are sent overseas, while newspapers and telegrams bring news of battles into kitchens and parlors back home. The war is short but transformative, cementing the country's ability to project power beyond its borders. Technological innovation surges alongside economic expansion. The telephone, electric light, and streetcars revolutionize daily life. Automobiles are emerging, reshaping transportation and industry. Factories become larger and more efficient, creating wealth but also deepening social inequality. Labor unrest intensifies, strikes become violent. The Pullman strike of 1894, for example, sees rail workers protesting wage cuts while federal troops intervene, leading to deaths and destruction. The struggle between labor and capital is a defining feature of this era, a test of the nation's commitment to both progress and justice. Urban life is crowded, dangerous, and vibrant. Cities like New York teem with energy, and the immigrant neighborhoods pulse with music, food, and trade. Yet disease is always nearby. The typhoid outbreaks, cholera scares, and poor sanitation make survival an everyday challenge. Families must navigate not only poverty, but the constant threat of illness. Children often work alongside adults, learning trades while enduring the hazards of urban life. Ordinary lives are remarkable not for drama, but for persistence, the quiet heroism of those who survive each day despite adversity. Education and social reform movements gain momentum. Progressive reformers like Jane Addams establish settlement houses, providing healthcare, education, and community support for the urban poor. Women's suffrage movements push forward, demanding political rights and greater social equality. Activists challenge child labor, unsafe working conditions, and political corruption. These reformers often face ridicule, opposition, and personal danger, yet they persist. Their efforts lay the groundwork for broader social change, emphasizing that survival is not merely physical, but also moral and political. The frontier, long a symbol of American opportunity, begins to fade. The Indian wars of the late 19th century have displaced tribes, confined them to reservations, and systematically undermined traditional ways of life. Boarding schools, strip children of language and culture. Treaties are repeatedly broken. Resistance is met with military force, yet the human spirit endures. Native communities preserve traditions in secret, maintain languages, and protect sacred knowledge. Survival here is cultural, a quiet rebellion against erasure. Meanwhile, African Americans face Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and widespread violence. Lynching becomes a tool of terror used to enforce racial hierarchy. Yet communities build churches, schools, and businesses, asserting dignity in a society designed to deny it. Everyday acts of resilience, teaching children, maintaining farms, and organizing politically become extraordinary in their persistence. The struggle for equality is ongoing, and its stories are often unrecorded, yet they shape the moral landscape of the nation. Internationally, America begins to project its power further. The Panama Canal project begins to take shape in the early 20th century, connecting oceans and increasing global trade. Economic influence spreads through Latin America and Asia. While ordinary citizens are caught up in local survival, the nation as a whole is beginning to see itself as a global actor, an emergent superpower, learning the responsibilities and contradictions that come with influence. Despite growth, inequality is ever present. The contrast between wealthy elites and working-class citizens is stark. Political corruption is rampant, with machines like Tammany Hall manipulating elections and exploiting urban populations. Citizens protest, organize, and strike, but progress is slow. The struggle for economic fairness, workers' rights, and political representation becomes central to the nation's ongoing development. Survival is no longer just about food and shelter, it is about asserting agency in a system that often suppresses it. Cultural change is evident as well. Newspapers, novels, and theatre shape public consciousness. Photography and early film document life in both urban and rural settings, capturing moments of ordinary struggle alongside extraordinary events. Art, literature, and music reflect the tensions of the age, hope and despair, innovation and exploitation, freedom and constraint. These cultural artifacts preserve not just events, but the emotional and psychological texture of the time, providing insight into the human experience of survival, adaptation, and endurance. And through all this, ordinary people continue to persevere. Factory workers, teachers, settlers, farmers, immigrants, freedmen, and Native Americans alike navigate challenges imposed by both nature and society. Their lives are not heroic in the traditional sense, they do not seek fame, but they are remarkable in their resilience. Every day survived is a victory. Every obstacle overcome is a testament to human ingenuity and endurance. By the time the United States steps into the 20th century, it is a nation of contradictions. Industrial might coexists with poverty. Freedom coexists with oppression. Expansion coexists with displacement. Every achievement is shadowed by unresolved tensions. Yet the country endures, grows, and transforms, driven by both ambition and necessity. As you reflect on this period, imagine the daily rhythm of survival in a rapidly changing world. Picture yourself walking through crowded streets of New York, the smoke thick in your lungs, the clatter of horse-drawn carts around you, neighbors shouting in languages you barely understand. Or imagine standing on the plains, watching the wind whip across fields as settlers struggle to plant crops in harsh soil. Or sitting in a southern town where the echoes of slavery linger in conversation and lore. The United States at this time is not perfect. It is raw, uneven, and often cruel. Yet it is alive, evolving, and resilient. Every struggle, every adaptation, every quiet act of endurance shapes the identity of the nation, preparing it for challenges and transformations yet to come. And the lingering question as this era closes is, can a nation truly become powerful and just at the same time? Or must one always outweigh the other? The United States enters the 20th century as a country both confident and uncertain, bursting with energy, yet haunted by contradictions. Cities hum with the roar of industry. Railroads and steamships carry goods, people, and ideas faster than ever before. Telephones connect towns, Newspapers bring news daily, and electricity begins to illuminate streets and homes. The nation feels larger, faster, and more alive than ever. But with that growth comes tension. Progress is exhilarating, yet survival remains an everyday concern. Immigration continues at a staggering pace. Millions arrive from southern and eastern Europe, carrying hope and hardship alike. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and others arrive at Ellis Island, stepping onto docks with little more than a suitcase and a prayer. They enter crowded tenements where plumbing is rare, diseases spread quickly, and families live shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Children are put to work in factories, shops, and sweatshops, balancing survival with the faint promise of education. Life is hard, exhausting, and sometimes deadly, but these immigrants endure. Their persistence shapes the cities, their culture reshapes American life, and their labor fuels the country's rapid growth. Meanwhile, the South remains scarred by the legacy of slavery and the Civil War. Freedmen face systemic racism, disenfranchisement, and violence. Jim Crow laws codify segregation. Lynchings terrorize communities. Sharecropping traps many in cycles of debt. Yet African Americans persist, building churches, schools, and social networks, asserting dignity and hope in a society that often denies both. The struggle is quiet and relentless, a test of endurance as much as principle. The industrial age continues to reshape the economy and society. Factories churn out steel, textiles, and consumer goods at unprecedented rates. Labor unions emerge, organizing strikes and protests to demand fair wages, safer working conditions, and reasonable hours. Some of these struggles erupt violently. The Homestead Strike, the Pullman Strike, and other labor confrontations demonstrate the tension between capital and labor, progress and justice. For ordinary Americans, survival means navigating a world where danger lurks in factories, mines, and streets alike. Political tensions shift and grow. The progressive era emerges, marked by reformers seeking to correct social and economic injustices. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt, Jane Addams, and W.E.B. Du Bois challenge corruption, advocate for workers' rights, and fight for racial equality. The government begins regulating monopolies, improving working conditions, and expanding public services. Yet change is slow, uneven, and contested. Resistance from entrenched elites and systemic inequality ensures that survival often requires both courage and compromise. Rural life evolves in parallel with urban transformation. Farmers struggle with falling crop prices, mechanization, and fluctuating markets. Populist movements emerge, advocating for economic fairness and political representation. The agrarian experience contrasts sharply with city life. Isolation, dependence on weather, and the challenge of distance shape daily existence. Communities band together, sharing resources, knowledge, and mutual support. Survival in the countryside is less dramatic than in the factories, but no less demanding. The nation begins flexing its power internationally. The Spanish-American War of 1898 signals America's emergence as a global actor. Territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines come under American control. The Philippines, in particular, become the site of a brutal conflict as the United States attempts to assert authority over a population fighting for independence. These overseas ventures are both a demonstration of ambition and a test of national identity, forcing the country to reconcile ideals of liberty with the reality of imperialism. Technological innovation continues to accelerate. The automobile begins to reshape transportation, creating new economic opportunities and social mobility. Electricity transforms homes and workplaces, extending productive hours and changing the rhythm of daily life. Communications, telegraph, telephone, and the rise of mass media shrink the world, connecting Americans in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. But with innovation comes risk. Factory accidents, urban fires, and disease outbreaks remind citizens that progress is not without peril. Cultural change accompanies industrial and social transformation. Literature, music, theatre, and art reflect the struggles and aspirations of ordinary Americans. Magazines, newspapers, and novels reach millions, shaping public opinion and fostering debate. Photography and early film document life, capturing both triumphs and hardships. These records provide insight into the human scale of history. Children learning under harsh conditions, families surviving in crowded apartments, farmers battling drought and frost. Ordinary lives become extraordinary when examined closely. Education expands during this period, particularly in urban areas. Public schools increase literacy, while universities become centers of research, innovation, and social thought. Women and minority communities fight for access, often against entrenched resistance. Reformers advocate for progressive curricula and social programs to improve health, sanitation, and civic awareness. These efforts demonstrate that survival is not only physical, but also intellectual and social, a struggle to claim one's place in a rapidly changing world. The progressive era also raises questions about justice and equality. Racial, gender, and class disparities persist, and reformers confront entrenched systems of power. African Americans, immigrants, and women face legal, social, and economic barriers. Activists organize, protest, and educate, asserting rights often denied to them. Survival becomes an act of resistance, a daily assertion of human dignity against forces that seek to suppress it. By the time the United States enters the 20th century, it is a nation of contradictions. Industrial might coexists with poverty, liberty coexists with oppression, expansion coexists with displacement. Ordinary Americans navigate these contradictions daily, shaping the country in small, uncelebrated ways. Their endurance, the quiet heroism of survival, becomes the foundation upon which national identity rests. World events begin to impact America more directly. The First World War erupts in Europe in 1914, drawing the attention of a nation that has, until now, largely focused inward. Initially neutral, the United States eventually enters the conflict in 1917, sending soldiers overseas and mobilizing industry at home. Factories produce weapons and supplies, while citizens adapt to rationing, labor demands, and the anxieties of global warfare. The war accelerates social change, challenges racial and gender norms, and tests the resilience of ordinary Americans in unprecedented ways. During and after the war, America undergoes profound social shifts. Women gain the right to vote in 1920, a milestone in the struggle for equality. African Americans migrate northward in the Great Migration, seeking better opportunities and escaping oppressive conditions in the South. Cities grow rapidly, blending cultures, languages, and traditions in a complex urban tapestry. Yet tensions rise, racial violence, labor unrest, and political polarization remind citizens that progress is never smooth or guaranteed. Economic expansion and cultural flourishing define the Roaring Twenties, yet the period is unstable. Stock markets soar, consumer culture expands, and technology reshapes daily life. Jazz spreads, Hollywood emerges, and new social freedoms appear. But beneath the excitement, inequality, speculation, and overextension create vulnerabilities. The stock market crash of 1929 brings the country crashing down into the Great Depression, a reminder that survival is fragile even in prosperous times. The Great Depression reshapes the American experience. Unemployment soars, banks fail, and millions face hunger, homelessness, and uncertainty. Families migrate in search of work. Cities swell with those seeking aid, and rural communities endure dust storms, crop failures, and relentless poverty. Government intervention expands under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, creating jobs, reforming financial systems, and providing relief. Ordinary Americans endure hardship, innovate, and adapt, proving that resilience is as crucial to national survival as industry or military power. By the mid-20th century, America emerges from depression and global conflict profoundly changed. World War II positions the United States as a superpower, both economically and militarily. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, factory workers, nurses, and farmers contribute to an unprecedented effort that transforms the nation and the world. Survival now encompasses both wartime endurance and post-war reconstruction, shaping a society that must balance prosperity, equality, and global responsibility. As you reflect on this period, imagine the ordinary lives that intersected with extraordinary events. A child growing up in a tenement, learning the rhythms of survival, a farmer battling drought and debt, yet teaching resilience to the next generation, a factory worker navigating dangerous conditions while contributing to national growth, a soldier crossing the Atlantic to fight in a war thousands of miles from home. Each life is a thread in the fabric of history, and each act of endurance helps the nation survive and evolve. By the time the United States reaches 1945, it has endured revolutions, civil war, industrial upheaval, global conflict, and profound social transformation. Its citizens have survived famine, disease, economic collapse, and oppression, proving that resilience, ordinary, persistent, and often unnoticed, is the defining characteristic of this nation. And the lingering question as this era closes is, how does a nation balance power, freedom, and justice when its survival has always required compromise and endurance? By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the United States finds itself standing at the crossroads of unprecedented power and deep uncertainty. The Second World War has ended, leaving the nation victorious but forever changed. Cities, industries, and citizens have been tested in ways previously unimaginable. You can almost hear the echoes of factory whistles and artillery fire, a reminder of how ordinary people sustained extraordinary national effort. The country is strong, but strength does not mean clarity. Survival, after all, is never guaranteed. The immediate post-war years are a period of adjustment, recovery, and tension. Soldiers return home, many physically intact but mentally scarred. They are eager to resume civilian life, yet find a nation in flux. Industrial production, once focused on war, must now transition to consumer goods. Factories retool, cities expand, and suburbanization begins. Ordinary Americans, veterans, women who worked in factories, farmers, and urban laborers navigate these transformations with a mixture of hope and fatigue. Survival now extends beyond physical endurance to economic and social adaptation. The Cold War begins almost immediately after World War II, shaping the United States in profound ways. The ideological struggle with the Soviet Union dominates politics, economics, and even daily life. Fear of communism infiltrates public consciousness. Citizens live with the anxiety that the world could once again descend into conflict, potentially nuclear in scale. Ordinary Americans are caught in a delicate balancing act, supporting national security while maintaining everyday routines of work, family, and community. Survival has expanded to include vigilance, awareness, and sometimes compliance in the face of ideological scrutiny. The economy flourishes despite tension, though inequality remains. Suburbanization reshapes the nation's landscape, with Levittown-style developments offering affordable housing for returning veterans. Automobiles and highways connect these communities to cities, fueling a sense of mobility and independence. Yet, not all Americans benefit equally. African Americans and other minorities face redlining, discrimination, and barriers to property ownership. Prosperity is uneven, and survival often means navigating both opportunity and systemic exclusion. Civil rights emerge as a defining struggle in this period. Ordinary citizens, students, teachers, activists, and clergy challenge entrenched segregation and discrimination. Landmark legal cases like Brown versus Board of Education declare segregation in public schools unconstitutional, setting the stage for broader social change. Yet victories are partial and often met with resistance. Protesters face hostility, violence, and arrest. Each small gain is hard-won, and survival in this era requires courage as well as perseverance. The Cold War also brings technological competition. The space race begins in earnest after the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, pushing the United States to innovate rapidly. Ordinary scientists, engineers, and technicians become the unsung heroes of this effort, working in laboratories, test sites, and classrooms to advance technology. Survival now includes intellectual rigor and the ability to adapt to an increasingly technical and competitive global environment. Meanwhile, popular culture flourishes. Television enters homes across the nation, shaping perceptions, tastes, and daily life. Music evolves, with rock and roll beginning to dominate the cultural landscape. Sports, cinema, and literature provide both entertainment and social commentary, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of the era. Citizens absorb these influences while managing the practical realities of post-war life. Work, family, and the constant adjustments demanded by a rapidly changing society. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, tests the nation's military and moral resolve. Soldiers are deployed to a distant, rugged landscape, facing harsh weather and fierce opposition. Families at home worry, communities support the war effort through rationing and industry, and the nation confronts the reality that survival, military, social, and personal, is a continuous effort. Ordinary people sustain extraordinary national priorities, often at great personal cost. Economic growth accelerates through the 1950s, creating both opportunity and tension. Consumer goods, automobiles, and home appliances reshape daily life. But inflation, labor disputes, and political tensions remind citizens that prosperity is not absolute. Migration patterns shift as African Americans continue moving northward in the Great Migration, reshaping urban demographics and cultural landscapes. These movements test social cohesion, requiring adaptation, resilience, and negotiation in everyday life. Education expands dramatically during this era, fueled by the GI Bill and a desire to prepare the nation for a competitive global stage. Universities swell with returning veterans seeking degrees, while research initiatives underpin scientific and technological advancement. Ordinary Americans invest time, labor, and resources to educate themselves and their children, seeing knowledge as a pathway to both personal and national survival. The fight for civil rights intensifies in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. emerges as a moral and organizational leader. Ordinary citizens, students, clergy, and workers engage in nonviolent protest, sit-ins, and marches, often facing arrest, violence, and intimidation. These acts of endurance demonstrate that survival is intertwined with courage, moral conviction, and the willingness to risk one's safety for justice. Technological advancement accelerates beyond imagination. The launch of satellites, the development of computers, and the proliferation of television transform communication, perception, and opportunity. Ordinary citizens interact with these changes daily, adapting to new media, work methods, and social expectations. Survival increasingly requires flexibility, literacy, and awareness of a rapidly shifting technological landscape. The Cold War shapes foreign policy, domestic politics, and social consciousness. Fear of nuclear conflict, espionage, and ideological subversion influences government programs, education, and popular culture. Civil defense drills, propaganda, and public messaging remind citizens that survival is not only about personal effort, but also about collective vigilance. Ordinary Americans navigate these anxieties while managing their daily lives, demonstrating resilience in both visible and subtle ways. Meanwhile, cultural innovation continues. Rock and roll, jazz, and early forms of popular music provide both escape and social commentary. Cinema addresses contemporary issues and nostalgia, shaping public consciousness. Literature explores human experience, social inequality, and national identity. These cultural products document ordinary lives, the struggles of adaptation, and the creative responses to change, highlighting how survival and expression coexist. By the early 1960s, the United States has emerged as an industrial, technological, and global power, yet social contradictions persist. Civil rights, economic inequality, racial tension, and political polarization continue to challenge the nation. Ordinary citizens remain at the center, navigating these dynamics with resilience, creativity, and persistence. Their experiences, both celebrated and overlooked, form the backbone of national identity, demonstrating that survival is not only a personal act, but a societal achievement. As you reflect on this period, imagine the daily lives behind the headlines. A mother teaching her children to read while managing a household. A factory worker adjusting to mechanized production. A teenager experiencing the first television broadcasts. A student participating in a civil rights protest. A scientist testing new technology that will eventually reach the moon. Each life is ordinary, yet each contributes to the extraordinary story of a nation defining itself in a changing world. And as this chapter of history closes, consider this. How does a nation reconcile the promise of freedom with the persistent reality of inequality? And how do ordinary people continue to survive, adapt, and shape the course of history in the face of global, technological, and social upheaval? The 1960s are a decade of turbulence, transformation, and unimaginable energy in the United States. The nation is a kaleidoscope of innovation, social movements, and contradictions, spinning so fast that even ordinary life feels revolutionary. Cities, suburbs, and rural areas pulse with change. The space race, civil rights movement, and shifting cultural norms create both excitement and tension. As you listen, try to picture yourself walking through these streets, living these daily realities, and sensing the underlying currents that are reshaping the nation. The struggle for civil rights dominates the landscape. African Americans confront segregation, voter suppression, and violence. Ordinary citizens become activists in ways that ripple far beyond their immediate lives. Children and teenagers participate in sit-ins at lunch counters, risking arrest and beatings. Adults march in protests, challenge unjust laws, and organize communities. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in Montgomery ignites broader action. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, and countless others guide, inspire, and sometimes shield these ordinary participants. Each individual act of resistance contributes to a movement that reshapes the nation, demonstrating that survival requires moral courage as much as physical endurance. The civil rights struggle is not isolated. Women push for greater equality, questioning traditional roles and asserting independence. Students protest, artists innovate, and intellectuals challenge norms. Ordinary Americans navigate an evolving society where social expectations are fluid, often conflicting, and deeply personal. Survival requires awareness, adaptation, and sometimes defiance. Daily life intersects with historic movements, making even mundane routines, going to school, attending work, managing households, part of a broader, transformative story. The Cold War continues to influence life. Fear of nuclear annihilation and ideological subversion shapes education, government policy, and everyday behavior. Civil defense drills in schools, propaganda campaigns, and the threat of espionage infiltrate ordinary consciousness. Families practice duck and cover routines, workplaces prepare for potential emergencies, and citizens monitor political developments abroad. Survival becomes not just a personal task, but a collective responsibility. Ordinary Americans must navigate this anxiety while maintaining work, education, and social routines. The space race accelerates during this decade, capturing imagination and ambition. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 has already ignited competition. By the mid-60s, NASA missions, astronauts in training, and scientific breakthroughs dominate public discourse. Ordinary citizens feel the excitement in classrooms, living rooms, and communities. Children aspire to careers in science, Teachers integrate space topics into lessons. Local newspapers cover rocket launches and space milestones. The nation's survival, prosperity, and global status increasingly depend on technological innovation, making ordinary efforts to educate, invent, and adapt essential to the broader story. Culturally, the 1960s are electric. Music, fashion, art, and literature reflect both optimism and conflict. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, Motown, and folk singers dominate airwaves, shaping youth identity and social consciousness. Cinema explores new themes, challenging norms, and pushing boundaries. Television broadcasts events live, bringing civil rights protests, political debates, and space launches into homes nationwide. Ordinary Americans engage with these cultural shifts daily, interpreting, reacting, and integrating them into the rhythm of survival and adaptation. The Vietnam War emerges as a defining crisis by the mid-60s. American soldiers are deployed to an unfamiliar, rugged landscape, facing intense combat, disease, and environmental hazards. Families at home experience anxiety, grief, and uncertainty. The nation is divided, with protests, counterculture movements, and political debates challenging both strategy and morality. Ordinary Americans are caught in this maelstrom, navigating personal beliefs, national loyalty, and the practical realities of a global conflict. Survival is physical, emotional, and ethical, reflecting the complexity of modern warfare and society. Economic growth continues alongside social upheaval. The post-war boom provides jobs, homes, and consumer goods, yet inequality persists. Urban renewal reshapes neighborhoods, often displacing marginalized communities. Education expands, science advances, and technology proliferates. Yet these benefits are uneven, highlighting disparities in race, class, and geography. Ordinary citizens negotiate daily survival amidst prosperity and exclusion, demonstrating resilience in its many forms. The feminist movement gains momentum. Women question traditional roles, advocate for workplace equality, and demand political representation. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique articulates widespread discontent, inspiring activism. Ordinary women balance family responsibilities, employment, and advocacy, demonstrating that survival and social transformation are intertwined. Each personal choice, career, education, activism is part of a broader movement reshaping national identity and values. Urban life remains both dynamic and precarious. Cities grow rapidly, fueled by migration from the south, international immigration, and industrial expansion. Crowded neighborhoods, inadequate housing, and public health challenges coexist with cultural vibrancy and economic opportunity. Ordinary citizens adapt daily, navigating transport, employment, and community obligations while managing the ever-present risks of urban living. Survival is practical, social, and psychological. Technological innovation transforms daily routines. Televisions enter homes in increasing numbers, connecting citizens to national and global events. Household appliances, automobiles, and communication devices reshape domestic life. Factories and industries adopt new processes, changing employment patterns and urban landscapes. Ordinary Americans interact with these technologies continuously, adapting habits, skills, and expectations in a world that is faster, louder, and more interconnected than ever before. Education remains a central pillar of survival and progress. Schools expand, curricula evolve, and access gradually increases. Ordinary students navigate these systems, preparing for careers, civic participation, and personal advancement. Teachers adapt, communities support, and families invest in education despite challenges. Each act of learning, each lesson absorbed, contributes to the nation's capacity to innovate, compete, and endure. The 1960s also reveal stark contrasts in national life. Technological and cultural progress coexist with systemic inequality, conflict, and fear. Ordinary Americans confront these contradictions daily, negotiating social expectations, economic opportunity, and personal safety. Survival requires intelligence, adaptability, and often courage, reflecting the broader moral and practical dilemmas shaping national identity. By the end of the decade, the United States has transformed yet again. Civil rights victories provide legal frameworks for equality, though social change is incomplete. The feminist movement gains strength, influencing public discourse and policy. Urban and technological transformations reshape daily life. Global conflicts and ideological struggles remain urgent and unresolved. Ordinary citizens, workers, students, activists, and families navigate these complexities with endurance and creativity. Their lived experience is the true backbone of history, proving that survival is both individual and collective, practical and moral. As you reflect on this era, imagine the ordinary rhythms and extraordinary pressures. A teenager attending a sit-in, a mother teaching children while working multiple jobs, a soldier adjusting to combat and displacement, a scientist contributing to space exploration, a teacher integrating new social awareness into classrooms. These lives, small in isolation yet massive in aggregate, illustrate how a nation endures, adapts, and progresses. And the lingering question as this decade closes is, how do ordinary citizens sustain moral courage, resilience, and hope when their nation faces both promise and peril? And how do their choices shape the future of a country poised between conflict, innovation, and transformation? The United States enters the 70s as a nation still grappling with the legacies of the previous decade. The social, political, and economic landscape is complex. The Vietnam War has left scars, civil rights movements continue to demand justice, and the promise of post-war prosperity now seems more fragile than ever. Ordinary Americans navigate these changes daily, their survival, physical, economic, and moral intertwined with the nation's trajectory. The aftermath of the Vietnam War dominates public consciousness. Soldiers return home, some physically unharmed but mentally burdened with trauma, guilt, and disillusionment. Families must reintegrate loved ones into everyday life, often without sufficient support. Communities grapple with divided opinions on the war, questioning national decisions and military strategies. Ordinary citizens experience the weight of global conflict on a personal scale. Economic strain, moral conflict, and social tension become part of daily survival. The civil rights movement, though legally advanced by the 1960s, continues to confront entrenched inequality and discrimination. African Americans fight for access to quality education, fair employment, and political representation. Urban riots erupt in response to persistent injustice, highlighting the unresolved tensions in cities across the country. Ordinary citizens, students, activists, and community leaders play pivotal roles in these struggles, demonstrating that survival involves both endurance and active engagement in shaping societal norms. The women's liberation movement gains momentum. Ordinary women across the country challenge restrictive roles, seek workplace equality, and demand reproductive rights. Organizations form, protests organize, and public discourse evolves. Every decision to work, to study, to protest is both personal and political. Women's daily lives become intertwined with broader social struggles, illustrating how survival often requires negotiating cultural, economic, and legal landscapes simultaneously. Economically, the nation faces turbulence. The post-war boom slows, and inflation rises. Oil crises in 1973 and 1979 disrupt energy supply, causing economic anxiety and highlighting dependency on global markets. Ordinary Americans feel the impact in daily routines. Fuel costs rise, heating homes becomes more expensive, and economic uncertainty challenges financial planning. Survival now includes financial adaptation and resourcefulness, demonstrating that even everyday routines are shaped by global forces. Urbanization continues, but with complications. Cities expand, suburbs grow, and demographic shifts challenge social cohesion. African Americans and other minorities migrate to northern and western cities in search of opportunity, altering urban landscapes and creating cultural vibrancy alongside tension. Housing shortages, discrimination, and crime become pressing concerns, while ordinary residents navigate these dynamics daily, balancing survival, work, and community relationships. Education evolves in response to these social shifts. Schools grapple with integration, curriculum reform, and expanding access. Ordinary students experience changing expectations, new opportunities, and ongoing social challenges. Teachers adapt to these changes, often in difficult conditions, demonstrating that survival and progress are as much about education as they are about economics or politics. The cultural landscape reflects both hope and disillusionment. Music, film, literature, and art explore social tensions, rebellion, and transformation. Rock, funk, and soul dominate the airwaves, often conveying social critique or personal struggle. Films reflect moral ambiguity, political conflict, and human endurance. Ordinary citizens engage with these cultural expressions, finding both entertainment and insight into their own lives. Culture becomes a lens through which survival, adaptation, and social consciousness are both understood and negotiated. Political life in the 70s is marked by crisis and reform. The Watergate scandal shakes national confidence, exposing corruption at the highest levels of government. Ordinary citizens respond with a mixture of anger, skepticism, and renewed engagement. The scandal underscores that survival, both societal and personal, requires awareness, critical thinking, and vigilance. Trust must be rebuilt through accountability, transparency, and civic participation. The environmental movement emerges in response to industrial growth, urbanization, and ecological degradation. Ordinary Americans confront pollution, energy crises, and the consequences of rapid development. Earth Day, first celebrated in 1970, symbolizes widespread concern for conservation, sustainability, and public health. Survival now extends beyond the personal to encompass collective responsibility for the natural world, highlighting the intersection of ordinary lives with global and ecological realities. Technological innovation continues to reshape life. Computers begin entering workplaces, changing methods of production, communication, and information management. Ordinary citizens adapt to these changes incrementally, learning new skills while maintaining familiar routines. Technology alters work, education, and leisure, illustrating that survival increasingly involves the capacity to adapt intellectually and practically to new tools and systems. Health and medicine advance, yet challenges remain. Vaccinations, treatments, and public health campaigns improve life expectancy and quality of life. But emerging diseases, access disparities, and lifestyle factors create ongoing challenges. Ordinary Americans must navigate these realities, making decisions about health, family, and community in a world of both medical possibility and limitation. Survival becomes a balance of knowledge, resources, and practical action. The Cold War continues to shape daily life. Fear of nuclear confrontation, espionage, and ideological struggle pervades both policy and culture. Civil defense measures, international diplomacy, and public education reinforce the necessity of vigilance. Ordinary citizens live with these pressures subtly and directly, adjusting routines, attitudes, and plans in response to global uncertainty. Survival is thus as much psychological and social as it is practical. By the end of the decade, the United States has undergone profound transformation. Social movements challenge inequality. Technological progress reshapes daily life, and global engagement defines national priorities. Ordinary Americans, workers, parents, students, activists navigate these changes with resilience, creativity, and endurance. Their stories are often unrecorded yet form the backbone of the nation's survival and identity. As you consider this era, picture the ordinary rhythms of life intersecting with extraordinary pressures. A mother managing household and activism, a worker adapting to economic shifts, a student experiencing integrated classrooms, a citizen questioning national policies, a teenager influenced by music and culture. Each act, small in isolation, contributes to the resilience and transformation of the nation. And the lingering question as this decade closes is, how does a nation survive internal upheaval, economic uncertainty, and global pressure, while ordinary citizens continue to shape its moral and social trajectory? The early 1980s mark a period of tension, innovation, and transformation in the United States. The nation emerges from economic stagnation, oil crises, and social upheaval, with both optimism and unease. Ordinary Americans navigate daily life amidst shifting political, technological, and cultural landscapes, their survival increasingly tied to adaptability and resilience. Imagine walking the streets of cities, suburbs, and rural towns during this period. The hum of car engines, the glow of neon signs, the chatter of television sets broadcasting the latest news or music videos, and people adjusting to the relentless pace of change. Survival, in these years, is not simply about food, shelter, or employment. It is about staying relevant, informed, and connected in a rapidly evolving world. The presidency of Ronald Reagan, beginning in 1981, sets the tone for much of this decade. Conservative economic policies aim to reduce taxes and deregulate industries, while defense spending escalates to confront Cold War threats. Ordinary citizens feel the impact immediately. Workers adapt to changing markets, families manage budgets in uncertain times, and small businesses learn to navigate shifting regulations. Meanwhile, the Cold War continues to dominate both policy and daily life. Tensions with the Soviet Union escalate, nuclear arsenals expand, and proxy conflicts arise around the globe. Schools teach duck and cover, communities organize civil defense programs, and households stock emergency supplies, not always because an attack is imminent, but because fear has seeped into the cultural fabric. Survival in the 80s is as much psychological as it is practical. And ordinary Americans absorb these pressures quietly, while continuing with their lives. Technology reshapes the landscape of survival and daily life. Personal computers begin to appear in homes and offices, slowly altering the rhythm of work and communication. Video games, VCRs, and early cable television redefine leisure, while fax machines and emerging telecommunication technologies revolutionize business operations. Ordinary Americans must learn new skills to stay competitive, from typing and basic computing to navigating emerging digital tools in education and industry. Workplaces evolve alongside domestic life. Offices adopt new software, factories incorporate automation, and schools introduce computers to prepare students for the coming decades. In this context, survival becomes a continuous exercise in adaptation, intelligence, and curiosity. Economic reality remains uneven. Recessions challenge households, unemployment rises in certain regions, and inflation erodes savings. Families stretch resources, sometimes cutting back on luxuries to maintain essentials. Community networks, church programs, and mutual aid groups help bridge gaps, providing informal safety nets where government assistance may be insufficient. For many Americans, the 80s are a time of resourcefulness, finding new income streams, relocating for opportunity, or learning new trades. Each small adjustment is an act of survival, demonstrating resilience that quietly shapes the country. Cultural life in the 80s is electric. MTV launches in 1981, creating a visual revolution in music, celebrity, and youth identity. Rock, punk, funk, and pop dominate airwaves, while film explores social critique and personal struggle. Television and radio bring both local and global events into living rooms, connecting citizens to a wider world than ever before. Ordinary Americans interpret these cultural signals daily, integrating trends, opinions, and innovations into their routines. Music becomes an outlet for expression, rebellion, and identity. Films provoke reflection on societal norms. Television news offers both information and anxiety. Survival in this era is as much about cultural literacy as it is about economic or technological competence. Social movements remain active. Civil rights advocacy, although legally codified in previous decades, continues in response to urban inequality, housing discrimination, and unequal access to education. Women's rights movements expand, seeking workplace equality, reproductive autonomy, and broader social recognition. Environmental concerns gain prominence as awareness grows about pollution, energy consumption, and conservation. Ordinary Americans participate in these movements in subtle ways: voting, educating their children, reducing waste, or advocating within workplaces and neighborhoods. Each small choice reflects the entwined nature of survival, progress, and civic responsibility. Urban and suburban landscapes evolve dramatically. Cities face infrastructure challenges, rising crime rates, and social tension, while suburbs expand rapidly, offering a vision of stability and opportunity for returning veterans and young families. Ordinary citizens navigate commuting, employment, and social networks, balancing aspiration with practicality. Suburban development often masks underlying inequalities. Redlining and economic barriers prevent minorities from accessing new housing opportunities. The contrast between city struggle and suburban promise highlights the uneven nature of prosperity and reinforces the necessity of personal and communal resilience in daily life. Education plays a pivotal role. Schools integrate computers, broaden curricula, and attempt to address cultural diversity. Higher education expands, responding to new workforce demands and the growing prominence of technology. Ordinary students and teachers navigate these shifts, adapting to changing expectations and emerging knowledge. Survival increasingly depends on intellectual engagement. Literacy, technical skills, and the ability to process rapidly changing information become essential to individual and collective advancement. The Cold War casts a long shadow. Proxy wars, diplomatic maneuvering, and ideological competition influence policy and domestic behavior. Americans internalize these pressures through media coverage, civil defense programs, and political discourse. Global instability becomes part of daily consciousness. Ordinary citizens adjust routines, educate children about international events, and participate in civic decisions with heightened awareness. Survival is therefore not only practical but also informed, requiring engagement with both domestic and international realities. By the mid to late 80s, globalization begins reshaping economic and social patterns. Manufacturing declines in traditional industrial regions, while service industries and technology sectors expand. Ordinary citizens respond by retraining, relocating, or adapting to new forms of employment. These transitions are rarely celebrated in history books, but are fundamental to national resilience. The everyday endurance of workers, teachers, parents, and entrepreneurs ensures that the country remains functional and forward-looking amidst economic and technological shifts. Social consciousness continues to expand. Movements for racial equality, gender rights, and environmental stewardship influence policy and public behavior. Ordinary citizens contribute through voting, activism, and personal choices, reflecting the broader reality that survival is inseparable from civic engagement. Each individual action, conserving energy, participating in protests, educating children, or volunteering cumulatively, shapes the nation's trajectory, demonstrating that endurance is both personal and collective. As the United States enters the 90s, the nation finds itself navigating a post-Cold War world. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 signals both an ideological shift and a potential reordering of global power. Ordinary Americans experience the impact through global markets, cultural exchange, and media coverage. Domestic priorities also shift. Economic expansion accelerates, technological innovation surges, and social movements evolve. Citizens must adapt to the speed of change, often integrating new skills, knowledge, and awareness into everyday life. Survival, once rooted in economic and political stability, now includes adaptability to global interconnectedness and rapid technological change. Technological proliferation defines the 90s. Personal computers, early mobile phones, and the internet begin reshaping communication, commerce, and culture. Ordinary Americans experience both excitement and challenge, learning to navigate digital tools for work, education, and leisure. Communities adjust to new forms of connectivity, from email correspondence to early online forums. Survival increasingly depends on the capacity to adapt, learn, and leverage technology in ways previously unimaginable, reinforcing the role of ordinary citizens in shaping the nation's future. Economic expansion characterizes much of the decade. The United States experiences sustained growth, low unemployment, and rising prosperity. Yet disparities remain. Inner cities face persistent challenges, while suburban areas flourish. Ordinary Americans engage with these shifts in ways both visible and invisible, pursuing education, investing in property, starting businesses, or navigating the labor market. Each action contributes to both personal stability and collective national resilience, illustrating the ongoing interplay between individual initiative and systemic structures. The cultural landscape evolves with globalization, technology, and media expansion. Music, film, literature, and art reflect both the dynamism and anxieties of the era. Pop culture becomes a lens through which citizens interpret their own experiences, negotiate identity, and engage with society. Ordinary Americans interact with these cultural forces daily, drawing meaning, inspiration, or reflection from creative expression. Survival in the late 20th century is thus as much about intellectual and cultural engagement as it is about economic or physical security. Social movements continue to shape national life. Activism around civil rights, environmental issues, gender equality, and political reform influence both policy and community behavior. Ordinary citizens contribute in tangible and intangible ways, whether by voting, protesting, educating, or simply making conscientious personal choices. Each action reflects the recognition that survival and progress are intertwined, and that ordinary effort can have extraordinary, cumulative impact. By the turn of the millennium, the United States is a nation of immense complexity. Globalization, technological innovation, and demographic shifts redefine daily life. Ordinary citizens navigate these transformations, balancing work, family, education, and civic participation in a world that is faster, more connected, and more competitive than ever. Survival now encompasses physical endurance, intellectual engagement, technological literacy, and social adaptability. Each individual effort, quiet, persistent, and often unnoticed, supports the ongoing vitality and resilience of the nation. The early 21st century presents new challenges. The September 11th attacks in 2001 shocked the nation, introducing the threat of global terrorism into everyday life. Citizens confront fear, grief, and disruption, while governments respond with security measures, foreign interventions, and policy reforms. Ordinary Americans adapt. Commuting, travel, and public routines change. Communities provide support to those affected. Families reconcile vulnerability with resilience. Survival becomes not only about individual or local action, but also about collective vigilance and adaptation. Technological acceleration defines this era. The internet, smartphones, and social media reshape communication, commerce, and culture. Ordinary citizens integrate these tools into work, education, and personal life, navigating both opportunity and risk. Information flows faster than ever, requiring critical awareness, adaptability, and engagement. Survival becomes a matter of navigating both the benefits and perils of interconnectedness, reflecting the ongoing evolution of American society. Globalization transforms economics, culture, and social life. Trade networks, international markets, and cultural exchange reshape industries and communities. Ordinary Americans adjust to shifting employment landscapes, cultural influences, and social expectations. Survival depends on continuous learning, resilience, and the capacity to balance personal well-being with global interdependence. Each citizen's choices, actions, and adaptations contribute to the national narrative, just as they have for centuries. As the 21st century progresses, the United States continues to navigate social, economic, and political challenges. Movements for equality, environmental sustainability, and civic reform persist. Ordinary Americans engage daily, influencing local communities, workplaces, and cultural landscapes. Their endurance through adaptation, resilience, and innovation forms the backbone of national survival. History is revealed not only through wars, laws, or policies, but through the quiet, persistent efforts of millions who live, work, and dream within its framework. Reflecting on the entire arc from the early colonies to the present, it is clear that the United States has endured through remarkable complexity. Wars, economic crises, social upheaval, technological revolutions, and cultural transformations have tested its citizens repeatedly. Yet ordinary Americans, workers, students, parents, activists, scientists, and artists have navigated these challenges with persistence, creativity, and resilience. Survival, in this story, is both ordinary and extraordinary. Daily choices, incremental efforts, and enduring hope collectively shape the nation. As you listen, consider the ordinary lives that intersected with extraordinary historical forces. The factory worker adapting to automation, the child in an integrated school, the teenager participating in a protest, the parent balancing work, family, and activism, the scientist developing technologies that connect the world. Each life, seemingly small in isolation, contributes to the enduring story of a nation that survives, adapts, and transforms. And the lingering question as this narrative concludes is, how does a nation continue to survive, evolve, and define itself when ordinary citizens, acting quietly yet persistently, bear the weight of history on their shoulders, shaping the course of centuries through resilience, creativity, and hope?